He called me ma'am like it was an insult, not a sign of respect. I designed the core of the $3 million production system. But when the new CEO showed up with white sneakers and Bluetooth earpiece, he told me I no longer fit the company culture. 1 week later, the automated line stopped working. 2 weeks later, investors started pulling out, and the next month I sent them a letter with the heading, Cease and Desist. My name is Rebecca Langston. This is my story. I'd given 15 years of my life to Forgen Systems. 15 years of late nights, missed weekends, and endless innovation cycles. I'd built their industrial robotic systems from the ground up, starting with rudimentary code that evolved into what would eventually become the Omnivex control suite, my pride and joy. My digital child. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I arrived at 7:30 a.m., thermos of Earl Grey in hand, lab coat neatly pressed. Charlotte was just waking up, the summer humidity already hanging in the air despite the early hour. I'd parked in my usual spot not assigned, just respected by long-standing tradition. Some of the newer employees probably thought my name was engraved somewhere beneath the asphalt. I nodded to the security guard, Marcus, who'd been there almost as long as I had. "Morning, Ms. Langston," he said with the same gentle smile he'd greeted me with for over a decade. "Good morning, Marcus. How's Delilah doing with her college applications?" His face lit up. "Got accepted to NC State's engineering program, full scholarship." "That's wonderful. You must be so proud. Thanks to your mentoring sessions last summer, made all the difference." I waved away his gratitude, but the warmth of the exchange carried me through the lobby. That's how Forgen used to be a community, not just a workplace. We knew each other's families, celebrated milestones together. The first sign something was wrong came when my access card failed at the elevator. The little light flashed red instead of green, an angry digital eye refusing to recognize me. "Try again, Ms. Langston," said Marcus, frowning slightly. "System's been glitchy since the upgrade last week." I swiped again. Same result. "Let me call up to IT," Marcus offered, reaching for his phone. That's when Darren Kessler strode through the revolving doors, immaculate in his tailored blue suit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. White sneakers, because apparently that was what visionary tech leaders wore now, and the omnipresent Bluetooth earpiece glowing blue against his ear. At 32, he looked like he'd walked straight out of a 30 under 30 photo shoot. "Morning, folks," he said without looking at either of us, eyes fixed on his phone. "Beautiful day for disruption, isn't it?" Before I could speak, a young woman I didn't recognize, probably one of the dozen new hires Darren had brought in, hurried to his side with a protein shake in one hand and a tablet in the other. "Your 8:15 with the VCs is confirmed, and I've uploaded the new pitch deck. The one with the augmented reality integration mock-ups," she said, matching his stride. "Perfect. Amber. Did legal sign off on the OmniSync branding?" "Yes, all cleared. Marketing wants to run a teaser campaign starting next week." I stepped forward, thermos clutched in one hand, access card in the other. "Excuse me, Darren, my card seems to be..." He looked up then, as if noticing me for the first time. Something flickered across his face, annoyance, perhaps embarrassment. He glanced at the young woman beside him. "Amber, could you please escort Ms. Langston to HR? I believe she has an appointment." "I don't have any." "It's all been arranged," he said, finally meeting my eyes. His voice dropped, taking on what I'm sure he thought was a compassionate tone. "Rebecca, we've prepared a generous severance package. Amber will walk you through everything." The lobby seemed to tilt beneath my feet. 15 years, and I was being dismissed like an outdated piece of equipment. "You're firing me without any warning or discussion." Darren glanced around, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of this exchange. "We're streamlining operations, pivoting toward a more agile methodology. It's not personal." "Not personal, I built this company's core technology." He sighed, taking a bite of his protein bar. "And we appreciate your contributions. But Forgen needs to evolve. We're implementing lean management principles, moving toward more cutting-edge approaches." Marcus was staring, wide-eyed. A few other employees had paused in the lobby, pretending to check their phones while watching the drama unfold. A young man in skinny jeans and a graphic t-shirt approached, tablet in hand. "Excuse me, are you from HR? I'm supposed to start my internship today, and—" "No," I said sharply. "I'm the lead systems engineer. Or I was, until about 30 seconds ago." The intern backed away, mumbling apologies. Darren checked his watch. "Amber will handle this. I've got investors waiting." He turned to go, then paused. "You know, Rebecca, you've done excellent work, but sometimes companies outgrow their founding team. It's the natural order of things." I stared at him, speechless with rage and shock. The founding team? I wasn't some startup relic. I was 44, for God's sake, not 74. As he walked away, I heard him say into his earpiece, "Kyle, talk to me about the deployment timeline for OmniSync. We need to accelerate." OmniSync? My system, rebranded without my knowledge or consent. Amber shifted uncomfortably beside me. "If you'll follow me, ma'am, we have your paperwork ready. You'll need to turn in your company phone and laptop before you leave." "Ma'am," like I was some antiquated fixture, a relic from another era. I followed her to HR in a daze, clutching my thermos like an anchor to reality. 15 years ended in a 5-minute conversation in the lobby. As I signed papers in a sterile conference room, my mind raced through the implications. They were moving forward with Omnivex, but calling it OmniSync. The system I'd built in my garage during countless nights and weekends. The system I'd patented in my own name, with multiple overlapping protections. The system that, technically, Forgen had no legal right to use without my explicit permission. 3 hours later, I walked out of the Forgen building for the last time, carrying a cardboard box with 15 years of personal items. Photos, awards, the mug my team had given me when we secured our first major contract. My security badge had been deactivated, my email terminated, my legacy seemingly erased. But as I drove home, something cold and determined settled in my chest. I hadn't given Forgen everything, not by a long shot. Robert Ellison, the previous CEO, had known about my patents. We'd discussed licensing arrangements, but in the easy, informal way of the old Forgen. "We'll get to the paperwork eventually, Beck," he'd say with his characteristic chuckle. "Let's focus on making this technology sing first." I'd even offered to sell the full rights for a symbolic dollar, a gesture of loyalty to the company I loved. But Robert retired before we formalized anything. And then came Darren with his disruption and agility and complete ignorance of what actually made Forgen's technology special. As I pulled into my driveway, I made a decision. I wouldn't sabotage anything that wasn't my style. But I also wouldn't stand by while my life's work was stolen and rebranded by a man who couldn't tell a logic gate from a garden gate. I unlocked the door to my home, set down the box, and headed straight for my garage. Unlike the chaotic, beer poster-decorated workspaces of Silicon Valley lore, my lab was meticulous. 3 workstations with customized mechanical keyboards, monitors mounted at precise angles, tools arranged by function and frequency of use. This was where Omnivex had been born. I booted up my personal system, fingers flying across the keyboard. I hadn't built backdoors into Forgen systems, I was too ethical for that. But I had built Omnivex with sophisticated self-protection protocols, the kind that would activate if someone tried to modify core functionality without proper authentication. And I was the only one with that authentication. I didn't need to do anything malicious. I just needed to wait. The first problem started exactly 1 week after my unceremonious departure. I knew because Martin Chen, my former deputy, called me in a panic. "Rebecca, the assembly line's going haywire," he said without preamble when I answered. "Robots are freezing mid-sequence, quality control is flagging every third item as defective, and nobody can figure out why." I settled deeper into my porch swing, watching a hummingbird dart around my feeder. "That sounds stressful. Martin, have you tried rebooting the primary controller?" Of course, first thing we did, then we tried rolling back to last week's configuration. But the system won't accept it, Keeps showing some error about architectural integrity compromised. I took a sip of my tea. Interesting. Have you asked your new boss? I'm sure Darren has some agile methodology to address this. Martin's frustrated sigh carried clearly through the phone. He's been in back-to-back calls with investors all day. Kyle's team is trying to fix it, but they didn't build the system. They don't understand your unique coding approach. My unique coding approach had been a point of contention even before Darren arrived. I'd developed a proprietary logic framework for Omnivex, one that made perfect sense to me but looked like hieroglyphics to anyone else. It wasn't deliberate obfuscation, just the natural outcome of a self-taught programmer building complex systems over many years. I'm sorry to hear that, Martin. I'd help if I could. But I'm no longer employed by Forgen. Remember, rather abruptly dismissed, if memory serves. Rebecca, please. The production line's down. We're losing thousands every hour. I closed my eyes, feeling a twinge of guilt. Martin was a good guy caught in a bad situation. Have Kyle check the authentication protocols in the kernel module. The system is designed to validate any modifications against the original architectural specifications. When, and if it doesn't match, then Omnivex will revert to safe mode until proper validation is provided. How do we provide that validation? I hesitated. The system requires biometric confirmation from the original architect. That would be me. Silence stretched between us. They really didn't think this through, did they? Martin finally said, apparently not. Will you come in? Just to get us back online, Darren doesn't need to know. I set my teacup down with a clink. Martin, I was escorted out of the building by security. My badge was deactivated while I stood in the lobby. I think it would be a little obvious if I showed up now. We're desperate, Rebecca. I'm sorry. But this isn't my problem anymore. I suggest you explain to Darren that his new OmniSync system is actually my Omnivex system, which is protected by multiple patents and authentication protocols. Perhaps then he'd like to discuss proper licensing arrangements. 2 days later, the problems at Forgen had escalated. I didn't need Martin's panicked calls to know this. It was all over the industry newsletters and local business reports. Manufacturing disruption at Forgen Systems. Read one headline, Robotics leader faces production crisis, proclaimed another. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was simply watching from afar as my creation protected itself from unauthorized tampering. Omnivex was designed with robust integrity checks if someone tried to modify core functionality without proper credentials. It would systematically lock down, preserving its original state exactly as it was doing now. On day 10 after my dismissal, I received a text from Sandra in accounting, one of the few colleagues I'd been close with. Investors pulling out, Darren going ballistic, 3 engineers quit today. What did you do? I replied truthfully, nothing. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. By the end of week 2, Forgen's stock had dropped 18%. An emergency board meeting had been called. Customers were threatening to cancel orders. And still, no one had reached out to me officially. Pride. It was always about pride with men like Darren Kessler. On day 16, I decided it was time to act. I contacted Patricia Winters, an intellectual property attorney I'd consulted years ago when filing my patents. Rebecca, she said warmly when we met for coffee. I've been following the Forgen situation. Fascinating case study in proper IP management, or lack thereof. I smiled, pushing a USB drive across the table. Here's everything you need: patent documentation, original code repositories, time-stamped development logs, and emails between myself and Robert Ellison discussing potential licensing arrangements that were never formalized. Patricia raised an eyebrow as she pocketed the drive. And what outcome are you looking for here? Justice, I said, then laughed at how melodramatic that sounded. And compensation for the unauthorized use of my intellectual property, I'm thinking? $31 million. She nearly choked on her cappuccino. That's precise. $3 million for each year I worked there, plus 1 million for the disrespect of firing me in the lobby. Patricia's eyes twinkled. I like how you think. But they might fight this. They can try. But their entire production system is dead in the water. And only my fingerprint will revive it. Literally, I built in biometric authentication that requires my actual fingerprint to authorize architectural changes. Elegant, Patricia admitted. What else do you want besides the money? I thought for a moment. A public apology in 3 major technical journals, acknowledging my role as the creator of Omnivex and the oversight in proper licensing. Making Darren eat crow. Precisely. 3 days later, Patricia's firm delivered a cease and desist letter to Forgen Systems, outlining the patent infringements and unauthorized use of my intellectual property. The letter included my terms $31 million for full licensing rights, plus the public apology. The response was swift, but not from Forgen's legal team as expected. It was Martin who called me, voice tight with stress. Rebecca, the entire system just shut down completely. Every screen is showing the same message. Unauthorized architectural modifications detected. System locked, pending verification from primary architect. And there's a timer counting down from 72 hours. I sipped my tea. Yes, that would be the final security protocol engaging. After detecting multiple unauthorized attempts to circumvent the authentication requirements, Omnivex initiates a complete lockdown. What happens when the timer reaches 0? All operational data is securely archived and the system resets to factory condition. Factory condition that would erase months of production data. Years, actually, it's a complete reset. Rebecca, this is sabotage. No. Martin, this is security. I designed Omnivex to protect itself from exactly this kind of tampering. If Forgen had approached me properly about licensing the technology, none of this would be happening. Darren's threatening legal action. I laughed. Actually laughed. On what grounds I haven't touched your systems? I haven't hacked anything. The security protocols were documented in the original specifications, the ones Darren clearly never bothered to read before rebranding my work as OmniSync. Martin was quiet for a long moment. The board is meeting tonight. Emergency session. I imagine they have a lot to discuss. The next morning, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, a gruff voice identified himself as Harold Winters, chairman of Forgen's board of directors. Ms. Langston, I believe we need to talk. 24 hours later, I walked back into Forgen Systems, not through the lobby, but through the executive entrance, escorted by Harold himself. He was in his 60s, with salt and pepper hair and the weathered look of someone who'd navigated multiple corporate storms. Appreciate you coming in, he said as we rode the elevator to the top floor. Bit of a situation we've got. Indeed. He glanced at me sideways. You know, I warned against your termination. Told Darren you can't just discard institutional knowledge like it's yesterday's newspaper. But he was convinced we needed to. What was it? Infuse new blood into our innovation stream. Whatever the hell that means. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, where a palpable tension hung in the air. Staff scurried about with stressed expressions, barely looking up as we passed. Harold led me to the main boardroom, where Darren sat at the head of the table, surrounded by anxious-looking executives and a trio of people I assumed were lawyers. His usually immaculate appearance had deteriorated, tie loosened, hair slightly disheveled, the confident smirk replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. When he saw me, he stood abruptly. Ms. Langston, thank you for coming. No, Rebecca, now. No casual dismissal of my contributions. Mr. Kessler, I replied coolly, taking a seat directly opposite him. Harold cleared his throat. We've reviewed the cease and desist letter from your attorney, as well as the patent documentation. It seems there's been an oversight in how we've managed the transition of intellectual property. Darren's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. An oversight, I repeated. Is that what we're calling it? One of the lawyers, A sharp-faced woman with impeccable posture leaned forward. Ms. Langston, we believe there's room for an amicable resolution here. Fortune values your contributions, and Fortune valued my contributions so much that Mr. Kessler fired me in the lobby after 15 years of service, calling me outdated and no longer a fit for the company culture. Darren's face flushed. That's not exactly... It's exactly what happened, I cut in. You called me ma'am like it was an insult. You had a 20-something intern escort me to HR. And then you proceeded to rebrand my proprietary system, which you have no legal right to use, as if it were your own innovation. Harold raised a placating hand. What's done is done. We're here to find a path forward. I smiled thinly. My terms were clearly outlined in the letter. $31 million for full licensing rights to the Omnivex control suite, plus a public apology in 3 major technical journals. Darren made a choking sound. That's extortion. That's business, I corrected. The going rate for enterprise-level control systems of Omnivex's complexity is typically between 50 and 60 million. I'm offering a discount. The sharp-faced lawyer whispered something to Darren, who shook his head vehemently. Harold sighed. Perhaps we could discuss a more reasonable figure. Say, 5 million. The company valued Omnivex at 18 million in last year's annual report, I pointed out. And that was before the enhancements that Mr. Kessler's team attempted to implement. My price stands. We could fight this in court, Darren said, an edge of desperation in his voice. You could. I agreed. But according to my security logs, your team has made 27 unauthorized attempts to bypass Omnivex's authentication protocols in the past 2 weeks. That's 27 documented instances of attempted security breaches. And I checked my watch, 41 hours, the system will reset completely, wiping all operational data. How many millions will that cost you? The room fell silent. Harold cleared his throat again. If we agree to your terms, how quickly can you restore the system? Immediately. My fingerprint, a few lines of code, and everything goes back to normal. Darren slumped in his chair, defeated. Harold looked around the table, then nodded. We'll need to draft proper agreements, but in principle, we accept your terms. 31 million for full licensing rights, and the public acknowledgement of your work. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply nodded and stood. Have your legal team contact Patricia Winters to draft the agreements. Once they're signed and the initial payment is processed, I'll come in and restore the system. As I turned to leave, Darren found his voice again. You could have just told me about the patents from the beginning. I paused at the door and looked back at him. You never asked, Darren. You were too busy disrupting to do your due diligence. 1 month later, I sat in my garden, sipping Earl Grey and reading the latest issue of Robotics Engineering Today. There, in a full-page spread, was Forgen Systems' public acknowledgement. Forgen Systems acknowledges Rebecca Langston as the primary architect and patent holder of the Omnivex control suite, the foundation of our manufacturing technology. We regret the oversight in properly recognizing Ms. Langston's crucial contributions and intellectual property rights. Beside it was a small business item noting that Darren Kessler had stepped down to pursue other opportunities, and that the board had appointed Harold Winters as interim CEO while they conducted a search for permanent leadership. My phone pinged with a news alert. Tech startup collapses after CEO overlooks founding engineer's patents. I smiled, set down my tea, and picked up my tablet. With my new funding, I'd been sketching designs for the next generation of industrial control systems. Something even more revolutionary than Omnivex. Maybe I'd start my own company this time. I already had the perfect name for it, Langston Innovations. Old-fashioned, perhaps, but with cutting-edge ideas. Just like its founder. The morning of my dismissal from Forgen Systems played in my mind like a bad movie I couldn't stop watching. 15 years of dedication reduced to a 5-minute interaction in the lobby. My security badge deactivated while I stood there holding my morning tea. The humiliation burned worse than any technical failure I'd ever experienced. What Darren Kessler failed to understand was that Forgen's success wasn't built on flashy presentations and investor buzzwords. It was built in the quiet hours before dawn, when I'd solved impossible engineering problems while the rest of the world slept. It was built through years of meticulous documentation, careful testing, and innovative thinking that transformed industrial robotics from clunky machines into fluid, adaptive systems. My home felt strange that first day of unemployment, too quiet, too empty, despite being filled with the same furniture and books and mementos it always contained. I wandered from room to room, thermos still in hand, as if searching for a purpose I'd suddenly lost. By mid-afternoon, I'd moved from shock to anger. I retrieved my personal records from the fireproof safe in my home office, original design documents, patent certificates, correspondence with the patent office. All the evidence that Omnivex was mine, not Forgen's. My phone buzzed constantly concerned colleagues, industry contacts who'd heard rumors, recruiters already circling like vultures. I ignored them all, focusing instead on documenting everything. If this was going to become a legal battle, I would be prepared. That evening, I finally answered a call from Sandra in accounting. "Rebecca, what happened?" The official line is strategic restructuring, but everyone's talking. I laughed bitterly. Strategic restructuring, is that what they're calling it when you fire someone in the lobby? He did it in the lobby. Her voice rose in disbelief. That's not even legal. There are protocols for termination. Apparently, those protocols don't apply when you're implementing lean management principles. I couldn't keep the sarcasm from my voice. This is insane. Half the engineering team is in panic mode. Nobody understands how Omnivex works except you. That's by design, Sandra. I built that system from scratch, with my own proprietary logic framework. And all the documentation is deliberately incomplete. I smiled to myself, remembering how I'd always planned to create comprehensive documentation, someday. That day never came, partly because I was always too busy improving the system, and partly because a small, protective part of me wanted to remain indispensable. The board meeting was a disaster, Sandra continued. Darren presented the OmniSync initiative like it was his own brainchild. He actually used your slides from last year's strategic review, just rebranded with the new name. My fingers tightened around my phone. He what? Complete plagiarism. And when Michaels from engineering asked about the authentication protocols, Darren just waved it off, said his team would streamline legacy security features. I nearly laughed. Good luck with that. Rebecca, what's going to happen? I gazed out my window at the setting sun, a strange calm settling over me. Justice, Sandra. Justice is going to happen. The next morning, I drove to the small legal office downtown where Patricia Winters practiced. We'd met years ago at a Women in Technology conference, and I'd hired her to help with my patent applications. She specialized in intellectual property for individual inventors, not the usual big corporate clients. Her office was modest but elegant, with framed patent certificates on the walls rather than the typical law degrees and bar admissions. She greeted me with a firm handshake and keen eyes that missed nothing. Rebecca, your message sounded urgent. It is. I placed my folder of documents on her desk. I've been terminated from Forgen Systems, and they're proceeding with implementing my proprietary technology without proper licensing. Patricia raised an eyebrow as she opened the folder. The Omnivex system, I thought that was resolved years ago. It was supposed to be. Robert and I had a gentleman's agreement that we'd formalize everything eventually, but he retired, and the new CEO decided gentlemen's agreements aren't worth the paper they're not written on. Patricia finished, already scanning the patent certificates. These all look in order. 6 patents, all in your name, not assigned to Forgen. Correct. I developed Omnivex largely on my own time, in my home workshop. Forgen provided some resources, but the core intellectual property is mine. Patricia nodded slowly. And they're using it without a formal license. They're not just using it, they're rebranding it as OmniSync and presenting it as a new innovation. She whistled softly. Bold move. Stupid, but bold. She continued examining the documents. What about your employment contract? Any IP assignment clauses? I smiled. That's the beautiful part. When I joined Forgin 15 years ago, they were a small startup without sophisticated legal counsel. My contract specified that inventions created using company equipment and during company hours belonged to Forgin. Bay and Omnivex wasn't. I built the first prototype in my garage, on weekends, using my own equipment. When I brought the concept to Robert, he was thrilled but didn't have the resources to develop it further in-house. So we agreed I would continue development independently, with Forgin having first rights to implementation once it was viable. Patricia's smile widened. And you documented all this. I pulled out a stack of emails. Every conversation. Rebecca Langston, you beautiful, paranoid genius. She flipped through the emails, nodding appreciatively. So, what do you want to do? Immediate cease and desist licensing negotiation, full-on lawsuit. I considered my options. I don't want to destroy Forgin. Many good people work there, friends who have mortgages and children in college, but I want recognition and compensation. Fair enough. What's your number? 31 million. Patricia didn't flinch. Reasonable, given the technology's value. And besides money. Public acknowledgement of my role as creator and patent holder, in writing, in major publications. She made some notes. Anything else? I thought about Darren's dismissive, ma'am. His protein bars and white sneakers and boundless confidence in his own brilliance despite having created nothing of value himself. Yes, I said finally. I want to be present when they realize they can't make their fancy rebranded system work without me. Meanwhile, at Forgin, chaos was unfolding exactly as I'd anticipated. The first signs were subtle, sporadic error messages, minor calibration issues, the occasional robot pausing mid-sequence, nothing that would immediately raise alarms. Kyle Brennan, the hotshot programmer Darren had hired to modernize my code, dismissed these as typical integration hiccups. We're merging legacy architecture with next-gen interfaces, he assured the production team. Some friction is expected. But I knew better. Omnivex wasn't just code, it was a living system with self-protective features woven into its DNA. I'd designed it that way after a previous employer lost critical systems to a disgruntled IT administrator. My solution wasn't backdoors or time bombs, I was too ethical for that. Instead, I'd created a system that required regular authentication against its original architectural blueprint. Any attempt to modify core functionality without proper validation would trigger progressive security protocols, starting with subtle performance degradation and escalating to full system lockdown if the attacks continued. By day 3 after my departure, the production floor was experiencing significant disruptions. Assembly robots were misaligning components. Quality control sensors were hypersensitive, flagging perfectly good products as defective. Inventory management was scrambling to reconcile unexplainable discrepancies. Martin called me twice that day, his messages increasingly desperate. I let them go to voicemail, listening later with a mix of sympathy and vindication. Rebecca, please call back. Something's seriously wrong with the system. Kyle says he's found some unusual code modules he doesn't recognize. Of course he didn't recognize them. They were written in my proprietary logic framework, a system I'd developed that looked nothing like conventional programming languages. It was perfectly logical to me, but would appear as gibberish to anyone else. By the end of the first week, Forgin's production capacity had dropped by 60%. Emergency meetings were called. Engineers worked around the clock. Kyle and his team tried increasingly desperate measures to bypass the security protocols, not realizing that each attempt was only triggering more severe countermeasures. I monitored it all remotely, not through any backdoor, but through industry contacts and the occasional text from Sandra or Martin. I didn't need direct access to know exactly what was happening. I'd designed the system. After all, I knew precisely how it would respond to unauthorized tampering. On day 9, Martin showed up at my door unannounced, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "This has gone far enough, Rebecca," he said when I opened the door. "The entire production line is down. Customer deliveries are delayed. Darren is threatening to fire half the engineering department." I stepped aside to let him in. "Would you like some tea?" Martin. He followed me to the kitchen, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Did you do this? Did you sabotage the system before you left?" I filled the kettle calmly. "I didn't touch anything." Martin. "The system is behaving exactly as designed. Omnivex has sophisticated self-protection protocols that activate when unauthorized modifications are attempted." "Unauthorized? We own the system." "No," I corrected gently. "Forgen has implementation rights, but I own the intellectual property. The patents are in my name, not the company's." Martin stared at me, comprehension slowly dawning. "The licensing agreement was never formalized. Robert and I had an understanding, but we never signed official documents. And then Darren came along and fired the one person who actually understands how the system works." Martin sank into a kitchen chair, looking defeated. "He doesn't even know, does he? About the patents?" "Apparently not. Due diligence doesn't seem to be his strong suit." "So what happens now? The company's bleeding money every day the production line is down." I placed a steaming mug of tea in front of him. "Now Darren or the board has a choice to make. They can continue trying to brute force their way through my security protocols, which will only make things worse, or they can approach me about proper licensing of my intellectual property. And if they do, then I'll help restore the system. For a price." Martin sipped his tea, studying me over the rim of the mug. "You know, I always thought you were too nice for the corporate world, too ethical, too focused on the work instead of the politics." I smiled. "I am ethical." Martin. "I'm not sabotaging anything. I'm simply protecting what's rightfully mine. There's a difference." He left an hour later. No happier, but at least understanding the situation better. I knew he'd relay the conversation to someone at Forgen, probably not Darren directly, but someone who could get the message to the decision makers. Sure enough, 2 days later, the first official communication arrived, a carefully worded email from Forgen's legal department, inquiring about consulting services to address current system integration challenges. I didn't respond. 3 days after that came a more direct approach, a formal letter acknowledging my significant contributions to Omnivex and proposing a retroactive licensing agreement with a one-time payment of €250,000. I had Patricia send a brief response. "The offer is insufficient given the technology's value and current market implementation. Ms. Langston remains open to good faith negotiations." Meanwhile, Forgen's problems escalated. The manufacturing disruption made local business news. Customers began issuing formal complaints about delayed orders. The stock price dipped, then came the investor exodus. Sandra texted me on day 15. Emergency board meeting called, major investor threatening to pull out unless production restored ASAP. I allowed myself a small smile. The pieces were falling into place. That evening, I sat in my garage workshop, surrounded by the remnants of earlier Omnivex prototypes. Circuit boards, specialized sensors, handwritten notes covering years of development. This was where the magic had happened, not in Forgen's sterile corporate labs, but in my own space, fueled by midnight inspiration and endless cups of Earl Grey. I picked up an early control module, remembering the night I'd solved the adaptive response algorithm that became Omnivex's core innovation. I'd called Robert at 2 a.m., too excited to wait until morning. "Beck, normal people sleep at this hour," he'd grumbled. "This isn't normal. Rob, this changes everything. The system can learn. Not just execute instructions, but actually adapt to changing conditions in real time." He'd come over that same night, still in pajamas under his coat, and watched in wonder as my prototype adjusted its operations to accommodate deliberately introduced obstacles. "My God," he'd whispered. "Do you know what this is worth?" I did. And now, finally, so did Forgen. On day 16, Harold Winters, chairman of the board, called me personally. Ms. Langston, I believe we need to talk. His voice was grave, authoritative, but with an undertone of respect that Darren had never shown. I agree, Mr. Winters. I've reviewed your patent documentation. It seems there's been a significant oversight in our technology transition. That's one way of putting it. He cleared his throat. The board would like to meet with you, tomorrow, if possible, to discuss proper licensing of my intellectual property. Yes, and to address the current operational challenges. I'll be there, but Mr. Winters. Yes. I'll be bringing my attorney. The next morning, I dressed with particular care, not in the casual wear that had become tech industry standard, but in a tailored charcoal suit that projected authority and competence. No lab coat today. This wasn't about engineering, it was about business. Patricia met me outside Forgen's headquarters, immaculate in navy blue with a portfolio of documents under her arm. Ready to make history? She asked with a gleam in her eye. Ready to correct it, I replied. Harold Winters himself met us in the lobby, a courtesy Darren had never shown, and escorted us to the executive floor. The atmosphere was tense, with staff avoiding eye contact as we passed. Word had clearly spread about why production was down. In the boardroom, Darren sat surrounded by executives and legal counsel, looking decidedly less polished than when he'd dismissed me. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by tight-lipped apprehension. Harold began the meeting with unexpected directness. Ms. Langston, on behalf of Forgen Systems, I want to apologize for how your departure was handled. It was neither appropriate nor reflective of your contributions to this company. Darren shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. Thank you, Mr. Winters, I replied. I appreciate the acknowledgement. Now, to the matter at hand. We understand that the Omnivex Control Suite, or OmniSync, as it's been recently branded, is protected by patents registered in your name. That's correct. 6 patents covering the core architecture, adaptive learning algorithms, and security protocols. One of the lawyers cleared her throat. There may be some question about ownership, given that development occurred during your employment with Forgen. Patricia smiled thinly. My client's employment contract specifically limited company ownership to inventions created using company equipment and during company hours. We have extensive documentation proving that Omnivex was developed primarily in Ms. Langston's home workshop, outside regular business hours, using her personal resources. She slid copies of the relevant documents across the table. Furthermore, Patricia continued, we have correspondence between Ms. Langston and former CEO Robert Ellison acknowledging her ownership of the intellectual property and discussing potential licensing arrangements that were never formalized. Harold reviewed the documents, nodding slowly. These appear to be in order. Darren finally spoke, his voice tight. If these patents are valid, why didn't you mention them before implementing the system at Forgen? I met his gaze directly. I did, just not to you. Robert and I had an understanding that we would formalize the licensing once the system was fully implemented. His retirement and your rapid restructuring interrupted that process. So now you're holding the company hostage. Not at all. I'm simply protecting my intellectual property rights, property that Forgen is currently using without authorization. Harold raised a hand to forestall further argument from Darren. What are your terms, Ms. Langston? I nodded to Patricia, who opened her portfolio. $31 million for full licensing rights to the Omnivex Control Suite, allowing Forgen unrestricted implementation and modification rights in perpetuity. Darren made a choking sound. That's extortion. That's the market rate, Patricia corrected. Similar systems from major vendors are priced between $50 and $60 million. Ms. Langston is offering a substantial discount given her history with Forgen. Additionally, I added, I require public acknowledgement of my role as creator and patent holder of Omnivex in 3 major technical journals of my choosing. Harold glanced at his legal team, who were whispering urgently among themselves. And if we agree to these terms, you'll resolve the current system issues immediately. The security protocols require my biometric verification to authorize architectural changes. I can restore full functionality within hours of an agreement being signed. Darren leaned forward. And if we decide to scrap Omnivex entirely and build a new system from scratch? I smiled. You're welcome to try. But even your most optimistic engineers estimate that would take 18 months minimum. Can Forgeon survive 18 months without a functioning production line? Can you explain to your investors why you're abandoning a proven system to start over because you fired its creator without due diligence? The room fell silent. Harold looked around the table, then back to me. May we have the room for a few minutes to discuss? Patricia and I waited in an adjacent conference room, watching through glass walls as an intense discussion unfolded in the boardroom. Darren gesticulated wildly, face flushed. The legal team huddled over documents. Harold remained calm at the head of the table, occasionally raising a hand when the debate grew too heated. They'll accept, Patricia murmured. They have no choice. Darren will fight it, I replied. His ego won't let him concede. Darren isn't in charge anymore. Look at Harold's body language. The board has taken control of this situation. She was right. Even through the glass, the shift in power dynamics was evident. Darren might hold the CEO title, but in this crisis, the board chairman was calling the shots. After 20 minutes, they called us back in. Harold stood as we entered. Ms. Langston, we accept your terms in principle. $31 million for full licensing rights and public acknowledgement of your role in creating Omnivex. Our legal team will work with Ms. Winters to draft the necessary agreements immediately. I nodded, maintaining my professional composure despite the victory. I appreciate your decisiveness, Mr. Winters. Once the agreements are signed and the initial payment processed, I'll personally oversee the system restoration. Darren hadn't risen when we returned. He sat slumped in his chair, defeat written across his features. As we prepared to leave, he finally spoke. You could have just told me about the patents from the beginning. I paused, turning back to face him. You never asked, Darren. You were too busy disrupting to do your due diligence. Perhaps in the future, you'll remember that innovation isn't about rebranding existing technology. It's about respecting the people who actually create it. With that, Patricia and I walked out, leaving Forgeon's leadership to contemplate the cost of their strategic restructuring. The legal process moved swiftly after that. Within 48 hours, we had signed agreements and the first payment installment. I returned to Forgeon officially this time, badged as a consultant, and spent a day restoring Omnivex to full functionality. The system hadn't been damaged. It had simply protected itself as designed. Once I provided the necessary biometric verification and authorization codes, operations resumed as if nothing had happened. The engineers watched in amazement as production lines whirred back to life, robots resuming their precise choreography, quality control systems returning to normal sensitivity levels. It's like waking a sleeping giant, Martin murmured beside me as we watched the factory floor from the observation deck. More like convincing it that you're not a threat, I replied. Omnivex was never meant to be hostile, just secure. Kyle Brennan, the programmer who'd been trying to crack my code for weeks, approached hesitantly. Ms. Langston, would you be willing to explain some of your logic framework? I've never seen anything like it. I considered him for a moment. He was young, eager, probably brilliant in conventional programming paradigms, and he'd spent weeks failing to understand my work. I'll do better than that, I said finally. I'll teach you, not just the what, but the why. If you're interested. His face lit up. Absolutely, that would be amazing. And so began an unexpected epilogue to my Forgeon story. 3 days a week. I returned as a highly paid consultant, training a select team in the intricacies of Omnivex. The same system they'd tried to rebrand and claim as their own was now acknowledged as my creation with the licensing fees to prove it. Darren was conspicuously absent during these sessions. Rumors circulated that the board had severely restricted his authority, limiting him to investor relations while operational decisions were handled by a newly appointed COO. 1 month after our agreement, the public acknowledgments appeared as promised. Full-page statements in Robotics Engineering Today, Industrial Automation Quarterly, and the IEEE Journal of Manufacturing Technology, all recognizing Rebecca Langston as the creator and patent holder of the OmniVex control suite. The same week, a small business item appeared in the Charlotte Business Journal. Darren Kessler steps down as Forgen's CEO to pursue other opportunities. The article noted that Harold Winters would serve as interim CEO while a search for permanent leadership was conducted. I read the news in my garden, sipping Earl Grey and feeling a sense of completion rather than triumph. This hadn't been about revenge, it had been about recognition, about respect for the work and the person behind it. My phone pinged with a message from Patricia. Saw the news. Congratulations. What's next for the newly minted millionaire? It was a good question. With financial security and professional vindication, I had options I'd never considered before. I could retire early, travel the world, or simply continue as a high-priced consultant. But as I sat surrounded by the first blooms of spring, a different idea took shape. The next generation of industrial control systems. Something that built on OmniVex's foundation but pushed even further into adaptive learning and predictive maintenance. Something revolutionary. I opened my tablet and began sketching, fingers flying across the screen as concepts crystallized. By sunset, I had the outline of a new system, one that would make OmniVex look like a prototype. This time, there would be no ambiguity about ownership, no gentlemen's agreements or informal understandings. This would be mine from conception to implementation, with Langston Innovations on the letterhead and my name on the door. Let the disruptors try to keep up. In the months that followed, my life transformed in ways I could never have anticipated when I walked out of Forgen carrying that cardboard box of personal items. The humiliation of that day had evolved into something unexpected freedom. With financial security came the luxury of choice. I established Langston Innovations as a formal entity, renting a small but state-of-the-art facility on the outskirts of Charlotte. Nothing flashy, no ping-pong tables or espresso bars or nap pods that seemed mandatory in modern tech workspaces. Just clean, functional labs with the best equipment money could buy. My reputation in the industry, bolstered by the public acknowledgments and the widely circulated story of how I'd outmaneuvered Forgen's new management, attracted attention from surprising quarters. Venture capitalists called, established tech firms extended consulting offers. Former colleagues reached out about potential collaborations. I declined most overtures, protective of my newfound independence. But I did accept invitations to speak at several technical conferences, sharing insights on secure system architecture and intellectual property protection for individual innovators. At one such conference in Atlanta, I encountered Robert Ellison, my former CEO, now enjoying semi-retirement as a board member for various tech startups. Rebecca Langston, he said warmly, embracing me in the hotel lobby. The woman who brought down a CEO with nothing but patents and patience? I laughed. That wasn't exactly the plan. Rob? No, but it makes for a better story. He guided me toward the hotel bar. Let me buy you a drink. I want to hear everything firsthand, not the sanitized version I got from Harold. Over Scotch his and Earl Grey mine, I recounted the saga. Robert alternated between outrage at my treatment and pride at my response. I always said you were the smartest person in any room, he said, shaking his head. Should have formalized that licensing agreement when I had the chance. Could have saved everyone a lot of trouble. Water under the bridge, I replied. Though I admit there's a certain satisfaction in how it all played out. I bet. What are you working on now? Something revolutionary, knowing you. I smiled enigmatically. Perhaps. But this time, the patents and contracts are in place before the first line of code is written. He raised his glass. To lessons learned, and to whatever Rebecca Langston does next. We clinked glasses, And for a moment, I felt a wave of nostalgia for the old Forgin, the one that valued innovation over disruption, substance over style. You know, Robert said thoughtfully, the board still hasn't found a permanent replacement for Darren. Harold's doing well as interim, but he's pushing 70, wants to fully retire next year. I arched an eyebrow. Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting? Just planting a seed? He sipped his scotch. Forgin with Rebecca Langston at the helm. Now that would be something to see. I laughed. I think that ship has sailed. Rob, some bridges can't be rebuilt. Perhaps. But in my experience, no bridge is ever truly burned in business. Just temporarily closed for renovation. His words stayed with me long after we parted ways. The idea was absurd. Of course, return to Forgin after everything that had happened, impossible. And yet, 3 months later, as Langston Innovations prepared to unveil its first proprietary system, a predictive maintenance platform that could revolutionize industrial operations, I received an unexpected call from Harold Winters. Ms. Langston, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Not at all, Mr. Winters. What can I do for you? He cleared his throat. I'll get straight to the point. The board has been discussing Forgin's future leadership, and your name has come up repeatedly. I nearly dropped the phone. I'm sorry. We would like to discuss the possibility of you returning to Forgin in an executive capacity, CEO specifically. For once in my carefully controlled life, I was speechless. Harold continued into the silence. The company needs someone who truly understands our technology and can guide innovation responsibly. Recent events have made it clear that flashy MBAs with no engineering background aren't the answer. I found my voice. Mr. Winters, I appreciate the consideration, but given our history is precisely why we're reaching out. You built Omnivex, the system that remains our competitive advantage despite recent difficulties. You understand both the technology and its market applications better than anyone, and you've demonstrated impressive business acumen in protecting your interests. By bringing the company to its knees, he chuckled. By forcing us to acknowledge a $31 million oversight, the board was impressed, not offended. That's exactly the kind of leadership we need. I took a deep breath. I'm flattered, truly. But I've started something new. Langston Innovations is preparing to launch its first product, and we're aware of your new venture, he interrupted, and that's part of the proposal. Forgin would be interested in acquiring Langston Innovations as part of your return package. You would maintain control of your intellectual property while gaining the resources of an established company for development and distribution. My mind raced through the implications. The symmetry was almost poetic, fired unceremoniously, only to return as CEO, the ultimate vindication. But was it what I wanted? I need time to consider this, I said finally. Of course, take all the time you need. But Rebecca? He used my first name for the first time. Sometimes the most innovative path is the one that brings us full circle. That evening, I sat in my garden, watching the sunset and contemplating Harold's offer. The financial aspects were compelling. Forgin had resources that would take Langston Innovations years to accumulate independently. The practical benefits were clear, but there was an emotional calculation too. Could I return to the company that had dismissed me so callously, work in the same building where I'd been humiliated? My phone buzzed with a text from Martin. Heard the rumors. Is it true? Are you considering coming back? News traveled fast in tech circles. I typed a careful response. Considering all options. Nothing decided yet. His reply came quickly. Engineering team is buzzing. Kyle says he'll quit if you don't take over, can't face another clueless CEO. I smiled despite myself. Kyle, the programmer who'd once tried to crack my code, had become one of my most dedicated students during my consulting period. Another text arrived, this one from Sandra in accounting. Please say yes. We need an adult in charge. I set my phone down and closed my eyes, letting the warm evening air envelop me. The decision wasn't about revenge or vindication anymore. It was about the future Fortune's and my own. 2 weeks later, I walked through Fortune's lobby again, not as a consultant or a visitor, but as the newly appointed CEO. Marcus, the security guard, broke into a broad smile when he saw me. Ms. Langston, or should I say, Madam CEO now. I laughed. Rebecca is still fine. Marcus, how's Delilah doing at NC State? Thriving, says she wants to be just like you when she graduates. Tell her to aim higher, I said with a wink. The elevator that had once denied me access now whisked me to the executive floor, where Harold waited to make the formal introduction to the staff. The announcement had gone out the previous day, triggering a surge in Fortune's stock price and a flurry of industry speculation. As I stepped into the boardroom where my journey had come full circle, I caught sight of a familiar figure slipping out through a side door, Darren Kessler, clearing out the last of his personal items. Our eyes met briefly. There was no hostility in his gaze, just resignation and perhaps a hint of grudging respect. I nodded once, acknowledging the moment without words. He nodded back and was gone. Harold cleared his throat, drawing the attention of the assembled executives and department heads. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce Fortune Systems' new Chief Executive Officer, Rebecca Langston. Applause filled the room as I stepped forward. Not the polite, obligatory kind that had greeted Darren's pronouncements, but genuine enthusiasm, particularly from the engineering team, who stood along the back wall with barely contained grins. Thank you, I said when the applause subsided. I know this appointment comes after a period of transition for Fortune. Change is never easy, particularly in an industry that moves as quickly as ours. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of both familiar faces and new ones. But true innovation isn't about disruption for its own sake. It's about building on strong foundations, respecting institutional knowledge, and balancing cutting-edge ideas with proven expertise. The engineering team's grins widened. They knew exactly what and who I was referencing. As many of you know, I built Omnivex from the ground up. What you may not know is that I've been developing its successor through Langston Innovations, which will now merge with Fortune. Together, we're going to create technology that doesn't just meet industry standards, it defines them. More applause, stronger this time. I believe in Fortune's potential. I always have, even when circumstances suggested I shouldn't. And I believe in every person in this room, your talent, your dedication, your vision for what we can accomplish together. I paused, allowing myself a small smile. Even if some of you do insist on calling me ma'am. Laughter rippled through the room, breaking the last of the tension. Now, I continued. I think we've had enough speeches and corporate platitudes to last a lifetime. Let's get to work. We have a company to rebuild. As the meeting dispersed, Martin approached with a tablet in hand. Welcome back, Rebecca. Ready to see what we've been working on in your absence? Absolutely. I fell into step beside him, already feeling the familiar rhythm of Fortune's operations. And Martin. Yes, make sure my access card works this time. He laughed. Already done, ma'am. Already done. And so began the next chapter, not just of my career, but of Fortune itself. The company that had once discarded me as outdated now looked to me to guide its future. The patents that had been my protection became our collective strength. And the system I'd built in my garage became the foundation for innovations yet to come. Sometimes justice arrives in unexpected forms. Sometimes vindication looks different than we imagined. And sometimes, the most satisfying revenge isn't bringing someone down. It's rising higher than they ever thought possible. As the saying goes, success is the best revenge, but having the patents helps too.